2025 has been quite the year for the podcast, so let's take a look back at 2025 and some of the really fascinating things we've learned about the female body. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsy Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy and a pelvic floor physical therapist. This first clip is from podcast episode 63, where we covered the science of fasting as women. We talked to two experts earlier in the year, Dr. Katie Hirsch and Mel Silver, and they both mentioned fasting affecting women differently than men, more often in a negative way, often in regards to our hormonal system and our metabolism. This next clip covers a bit on metabolism and why we as women might not want to choose fasting if our goal is truly on body composition changes due to the different signaling within our bodies. So let's switch to metabolism a little bit. And this is where women actually thrive because we are metabolically superior or metabolically more efficient or more flexible in how we utilize certain fuel sources within our body. We are able to switch between different fuel sources and take from different fuel sources more efficiently than a man's system is. So historically, I guess what we utilize for our fuel sources has typically followed this pathway. We first utilize blood glucose, then we utilize stored glycogen within our liver and our muscles, which is the stored form of glucose. So glycogen, glucose, you can think of them as the same thing. Glycogen just takes a little bit to get to the point where we can use it as energy as glucose, and it is the stored form of glucose in the liver and the muscles. So we first tap into the blood glucose levels because that's usually the most available and the most readily available for us. Then we tap into liver and muscle glycogen stores, and then we tap into free fatty acids. That's historically what we've believed as how a body taps into different fuel sources for energy, whether that's for exercise or just like day-to-day tasks. However, it's been shown that women specifically have this flexibility within their metabolic system where we tap into that blood glucose first, but then we actually transition to those free fatty acids a lot quicker than a man does. They have to go through that process where we can go straight from blood glucose, utilizing blood glucose as our fuel, to free fatty acids. And this is because we have a lot more oxidative fibers within our skeletal muscle tissues. And so that is one of the theories that has been brought up to why we tap into those free fatty acids quicker than a man does. So one of the goals with fasting could be, hey, let's decrease our glucose stores initially so that we tap into those free fatty acids quicker, or that's historically been one of the theories. And for a man, that might actually make sense because if we can limit the amount of glucose that they have to utilize at the beginning of that pathway, they might tap into those free fatty acids storages early on in their workout. Where for women, we don't actually have to do that. We kind of skip that step. We skip the benefit of fasting because we utilize that glucose within the bloodstream first before we tap into those free fatty acids. And a lot of people think, oh, let's tap into those free fatty acids as fuel as soon as we can so that we're burning fat. But this is not necessarily like a 1-to-1 ratio. Yes, it does help that we can tap into those free fatty acids, but it's a lot more complex than that. But that is one of the reasons fasting has been promoted, is because if we can decrease the circulating glucose levels or stored glucose levels, then we might be able to tap into those free fatty acids sooner. Whereas women, we have that flexibility to go, okay, utilize all that blood glucose first, that circulating quick energy first, before we tap into those free fatty acids. But we don't necessarily have to go through the entire process that we've historically thought that men go through, but maybe a woman does not necessarily go through. The rest of the episode covers why fasting affects our hormonal systems, but also the research on when fasting might be appropriate for some women. And that subsect of women is in the minority. So take a look at episode 63, especially if you are interested in learning about fasting for the female body. Another hot topic is the topic of high intensity interval training and sprint interval training for women. And I think the reason they're so controversial is because of this big push in lowering and decreasing our cortisol levels. So in podcast episode 73, we chat why high intensity interval training and sprint interval training are especially important for us as women, and why zone 2 shouldn't necessarily be getting all of the hype when it comes to our training as women. So the first foundation we'll talk about is definitely one of the most controversial, which is why I wanted to start out with it. But we'll talk about high intensity interval training and sprint interval training. So HIIT involves short bursts of activity, typically 45 seconds to a few minutes at 85 to 90% of your heart rate max, or 85 to 90% effort, followed by usually a 1-to-1 work to recovery ratio. So if you do the exercise for a minute, you're also recovering for a minute. But that can vary, but that's just a general rule of thumb. So for sprint interval training, it's a shorter duration at 100% max effort, but basically max effort for 20 to 30 seconds, followed by a longer recovery, like 2 to 4 minutes in between. So why do high intensity interval training and sprint interval training get a bad reputation? I think it comes down to cortisol. There's been a big push around cortisol, I guess, propaganda. Cortisol is truly that misunderstood mean girl. We need it within our bodies, especially to build muscle. We also need it in order to have energy throughout the day. We need it to exercise. We want it to elevate during exercise, which I think is why HIIT and sit have this sort of negative connotation. However, with high intensity interval training and sprint interval training, what we expect and what we want with our bodies is a momentary spike in cortisol, a momentary cortisol elevation during that exercise, followed by our bodies being able to return to baseline. We do not want sustained cortisol elevation, but if we do the appropriate things surrounding high intensity interval training and surrounding sprint interval training, including a proper cool down, proper breath work, we should be able to help control that cortisol elevation that naturally happens and we want to happen with exercise. Over time, high intensity interval training and sprint interval training have also actually been shown to lower that baseline level of cortisol. So not within one session, we expect a spike within each exercise session, but over time, the more we incorporate HIIT and sit into our routines, the better our body adapts, and it's actually beneficial to our cortisol long term. So why are high intensity interval training and sprint interval training so important to have as part of our essentials in our exercise handbags, especially as women? A lot of it comes down to our skeletal muscle and our mitochondrial density. As women, we naturally have more type 1 skeletal muscle tissue fibers compared to men. And these type 1 fibers are built more for low load, long duration work. So think long runs. Your type 1 skeletal muscle fibers are the ones that help with your postural muscles and standing up without falling over. With our posture, you're having to hold a position, low load, low weight for a long period of time. So these are where those type 1 skeletal muscle fibers come into play. Men, on the other hand, have more type 2A and type 2X fibers, which are known for these fast, explosive, power-based movements. So think sprinting, jumping, those like really quick bouts of effort. Those are what those type 2 skeletal muscle fibers are utilized for, and the ones that men have proportionally more of compared to women. So as we all age, men and women, our skeletal muscle fibers start to shift to have more type 1 muscle fibers compared to type 2. And it's really important that as we age, we try and maintain those type 2 skeletal muscle fibers because they help us with catching ourselves if we're about to fall, standing up out of a chair, which you don't necessarily think of those as power-based activities now, but we need that quick reaction time in order to help ourselves if we start to trip over a rug or in order to get out of a chair, especially as we age. So as women, we also have a higher mitochondrial density than men, meaning we are naturally shifted to be able to handle more endurance-based exercises better than men. Because we naturally have more type 1 skeletal muscle fibers and we have a higher mitochondrial density, we need to work what we're not as good at, if that makes sense. So structurally and physiologically, we have a predisposition towards more of those endurance-based activities. So we really need to work on the opposite. So that high intensity, that sprint intensity training in order to help maintain and increase some of those type 2 fibers, and then also maintain those fibers as we age, in addition to working more of that anaerobic system within our bodies that doesn't necessarily need oxygen in order to power certain movements, since we do have such a high capacity for using oxygen for our movements with that increased mitochondrial density. I know that's a ton of science, but basically we are shifted more towards those endurance-based exercises. We're going to be better at those in general across the board
compared to our male counterparts. So since we are shifted that way, we want to be able to train the opposite, not only for the health of our bodies currently, but also long term. So it boils down to if we don't use it, we lose it. And when we don't have it as much as a guy does, we definitely want to train that system even more. If cortisol elevation is something that you're concerned about, we also chat through some ways to incorporate high intensity interval training and sprint interval training while also performing different actions and behaviors to help manage those cortisol levels, especially after that high intensity interval training or sprint interval training. One of the biggest segments of learning about the female body in the year 2025 on Wellness Big Sis the Pod came from our exercise handbag series that we did in the fall, where we covered why our bodies need certain forms of exercise and how to incorporate those no matter the style of exercise handbag that you like, whether you like traditional lifting, Pilates, bar, swimming, running, whatever sort of exercise you enjoy. There are ways to incorporate these essentials or these handbag necessities into our exercise routines and our exercise handbags as women. One of our most forgotten essentials in our exercise routines and exercise handbags as women is jump training. And in episode 74, we chat why we shouldn't forget it and why it is so important for us as women. And you might be thinking, jump training, Kelsy? What even is jump training? It's as simple as it sounds, really. It's jumping. It's loading your body, your musculoskeletal system, with extra than your body weight, with more ballistic movements that increase the amount of load that you're placing on your musculoskeletal structure, your joints, your muscles, your bones, your ligaments, your tendons, all of it. It is all affected in a beneficial way with jump training and is especially important for us to include as women. So a little backstory that we've mentioned on the podcast before, but if it's your first time joining us, I want to make sure that we have a little bit of a physiology lesson for when we start to talk about some of the benefits of jump training on our system. So as we age, no matter if you're male or female, we start to lose bone mineral density as we age, where bone breakdown outpaces bone formation. And this is especially the case with women. Women are at a higher risk for developing osteopenia, which is basically weaker bones, and the prerequisite or the one that comes before osteoporosis, which is a lot of the time what you hear about in older individuals and what increases the likelihood of fractures within the bone. So osteoporosis is the more advanced stage of that bone breakdown that starts to be extra concerning. And as women, we have a higher risk of developing both. So it's this imbalance, let's say, that we're constantly fighting against as we age. Oftentimes after the age of about 30, it happens pretty young, where we start to see some of the slowdown of that bone formation. And this process affects women more than men. So it's super duper important for us as women to load those bones and provide sufficient stimulus to our bones so that we can build bone in our younger years, our adolescent and young adult years, and then also work against the natural physiologic process of bone breakdown as we age. And there are studies that show through purposeful stimulus, whether that is jump training or another essential in our handbag that we'll talk about later in the month, we can actually work to combat some of that bone breakdown. In our younger years, a lot of people don't know about and don't know how to positively build that foundation of bone mineral density. So it is something to watch out for, no matter if you're male or female, but especially if you are a female, because the max amount of bone mineral density, the foundation for our bones, the strength of our bones, is developed in those adolescent, teen, 20 years. So it's super duper important that we build that foundation in our younger years so that when we're older and our bone breakdown is naturally outpacing our bone formation, we have this greater foundation to stand on. So how can we actually strengthen our bones to build that solid foundation? In our teens, 20s, 30s, this is the time where we can optimize that foundation. And really, honestly, in our adolescence, up to 40% of our bone mineral density is formed by puberty. So there's a sharp increase in our younger years, and then it starts to plateau off to where in our later years, we're fighting against this decline. And we really want to make sure that we build up the strength of our bones early on so that we can reduce the slope of that decline and maintain some of that bone mineral density as we age. So how do we strengthen our bones? Bones respond to mechanical load in multiple directions. Similar to how you think about muscles, right? When we stress a muscle, it starts to send reinforcements in order to build up that muscle to be able to tolerate that load the next time. muscles pull on bones. So the same thing happens to our bones. Bones start to respond to that mechanical load, that stress and strain in a lot of different directions. So in a similar way that our body is cued to build muscle in areas during training, our bones are also cued to build more bones in area that we load. And that load can come through strength training or through something like jump training. And jump training is almost like bone building on steroids a little bit, especially as we age. And as a side note, muscles pull on bones. So anytime we load the muscles, we are also loading the bones. The important thing for both loading the muscles and the bones is that we do it in a safe way. Jump training sounds super scary, especially for people who aren't used to doing jump rope and squat jumps or box jumps. It can be super scary and it can introduce us to injury if our bodies aren't prepped and primed for it. So a lot of the studies that say how beneficial jump training is actually start with a foundational strength training program to help the body build that foundation for when the researchers decided to add that jump training into the program. In this episode, we also chat how to incorporate it into your routines, but it's one of the simplest and quickest things to add to your routine to get a lot of bang for your buck. We cover the exact parameters in the episode, but just know it shouldn't take more than 5-ish minutes each week, oftentimes even less. Lastly, one of the most beneficial things for the female body, strength training. We covered the popular girl strength training in episode 76 as one of the final episodes in our exercise handbag series. So as popular as strength training is, it is for a very good reason. It's very protective against a lot of different things. So not only does it help us with our toning and our current aesthetic goals, but it also is protective for our entire musculoskeletal system, our bone health, our brain, our balance, especially as we age. So strength training affects us positively now and way in the future, which is why it really is the well-deserved popular girl that everyone's talking about. From the most basic standpoint, strength training or resistance training is muscle contraction against an external resistance to improve strength, endurance, or the size of a muscle. So the important thing to note is that we are contracting against a resistance, whether that is shortening a muscle or lengthening a muscle, or we can also have static contractions against a resistance, such as like holding a platter in your hand when you're at a dinner party trying to serve food. That's an example of a static muscle contraction, but you can do the same thing with a dumbbell or with a weight or with a band or a variety of external resistances. So how does strength training actually affect us physiologically? The very first mechanism that we gain strength by is actually through neural adaptations, which is basically improving the connection of our brain to our skeletal muscle fibers. Initially, strength training increases our ability to recruit those motor units, which is basically a collection of muscle fibers that are stimulated by a motor neuron. Our bodies figure out what to recruit better when we start a strength training program. Nerves are how we communicate with those muscle fibers, and so this first little strength gain that you might experience is actually based on our neural adaptations, which basically means better communication between our brain and our muscles. Not necessarily increasing the size of the muscles, but how we communicate from our brain to our muscle tissue. So physiologically, we also experience muscle hypertrophy. So when we lift a super heavy resistance, our muscles undergo small micro tears or micro damage that basically stimulates a rebuilding and repair process. That is why rest and recovery is so important. Exercise is actually the stimulus for muscle growth, but it's not where muscle growth happens. It just stimulates that micro damage to cue our bodies to send in all of those resources to repair and rebuild stronger than we were before. So muscle is repaired and rebuilt during the recovery. Exercise is just the stimulus for that repair. Our body is cued to reinforce that area so that we can handle the load better next time, which is why it's also important that we consistently load the muscles bit by bit over time in a heavier way so that we don't become static and plateau at a certain resistance. We always want to be pushing that threshold a little bit more to stimulate that muscle hypertrophy. Of course, we've chatted through the benefits of strength training and overall why strength training really is that girl, but also how to incorporate it into your routine, even if you don't typically like strength training or lifting. We covered so much of the female body this year. Of course, it's one of my favorite subjects as a physical therapist and one that I'm constantly researching, constantly learning about, and constantly trying to make that education and that research easier for other people to understand because there's so much conflicting evidence out there, especially when it comes to what we need as women. And my whole goal is to really try to
give people, especially girls, this education a lot earlier in life so that we can set ourselves up for success later on, especially when we're in our 80s, 90s, and we might struggle with fall risk or decreased bone mineral density, things that might make our mobility, our function, our everyday lives a little more challenging. So I love talking about the female body, and it was hard to narrow down some of my top moments from talking about the female body over 2025, but these were probably some of my 4 favorites and some of the 4 topics that I really want people to come back to and understand. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Fixes the Pod.